Very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us both in person and online for another installment in the United States Capitol Historical Society's ongoing series of book talks that explore topics in American history and congressional history. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the tremendous privilege of serving as Executive Vice President of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. And we're grateful that you're taking time out of your busy day, both here in person and online, to join us as we have this fascinating and timely conversation with a really great historian and practitioner here who's going to be talking about his fascinating journey. We're gathered to learn more about Kurt Deion's book, Presidential Grave Hunter. In 2003, 9-year-old presidential enthusiast Kurt Deion presented his father, Paul, who we're grateful to have here with us today, with an audacious request. Would he help him follow in the footsteps of historian Richard Norton Smith and C-SPAN founder Brian Lamb by taking him to visit the final resting place of every dead United States president? He got all he asked for and more. Deion's journey to these tombs, and from elementary school neophyte to college history major, was unorthodox. With his zany, boundary-pushing father at the wheel, straight-laced youngster found himself sneaking past Secret Service agents with a camera, purposefully locked in a cemetery enclosed with barbed wire, and handcuffed to the former Dallas homicide detective who was tethered to the alleged JFK assassin Lee Harvey Oswald when he was shot by Jack Ruby. If you've been following our webinars lately, that was a couple weeks ago. We just had Judge Burt Griffin from the Warren Commission talk about his experience investigating the Kennedy assassination. Most daringly, Kurt reluctantly gained entry to a vice president's private family burial ground in order to possibly become the single person who's visited each presidential and vice presidential burial site. In this history-driven memoir, which he's going to talk to us about, which he's going to speak with us today, Kurt reconstructs this decade-long cross-country quest and analyzes the evolution of his perspective on commanders-in-chief and what it means to visit a cemetery and pay respects to fallen figures. So with that, you've heard more than enough from me. Let me welcome up to the podium Kurt Deion, who's going to talk to us about his book, Presidential Grave Hunter. Kurt?
Thank you, Sam. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you to those who are here at Historic Congressional Cemetery in person and those who are tuning in online or watching this subsequently on YouTube. My name is Kurt Deion, and I actually work here at Historic Congressional Cemetery. I'm an education specialist, so I work with children on K through 12 programming, giving and developing guided tours and whatnot. And I'm glad that I was able to unite my current beloved workplace, the cemetery, with my old internship site, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, where I interned in a possibly long 9 years ago, now in the summer of 2015. I wanted to start with my book trailer. I'd never heard of a book trailer before till my father told me about it. And he said, it's like a movie trailer, except for your book. So I would just like to start off with that.
What the fact that you have been at every presidential grave site and every vice president's grave site?
Yes. Or I was starting off with that. Is this blurry?
Presidential Grave Hunter, one kid's quest to visit the tombs of every president and vice president by Kurt Deion. Tag along for a most unusual ride as the author recounts his life-affirming journey to these tombs and from elementary school neophyte to college history major.
So these are the sort of top guy, or basically coffin containers. So each sort of visible the president and Bruce Lee.
With his zany, boundary-pushing father at the wheel, his journey was unorthodox.
300 here at the original gravesite of Colonel Sanders. We couldn't find the extra crispy one.
This straight-laced youngster found himself sneaking a camera past Secret Service agents.
But you gotta tell the story about how you, between you and your father on the camera, how you got that in.
We weren't allowed to take pictures, and he's probably lucky he wasn't tasered or anything by the Secret Service.
Previously locked in a cemetery enclosed with barbed wire.
Sometimes you're gonna get locked in cemeteries and you have to call security, or you have to climb over the barbed wire.
Handcuffed to the former Dallas homicide detective who was tethered to alleged JFK assassin Lee Harvey Oswald when he was shot by Jack Ruby.
And Mr. Lavelle here was handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald, and Oswald was then shot during the transfer by a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby, and the instance was captured in a famous Pulitzer Prize winning photograph.
And most daringly, he reluctantly gained entry to a vice president's private family burial ground.
And you know, the one gravesite that everybody has trouble getting to that wants to do this is the Rockefeller, right?
Yes, Nelson Rockefeller, vice president of Ford.
How did you do it?
Well, as my father likes to describe it, it's an act of God.
So for an act of God, are there others in your family?
Yes, my mother, Lynn, and my sister, Olivia, who is 3 years younger than me.
What does she think about it?
What do you think, Dan Buchanan, Olivia? Fantastic. I think she said she loves president, you know?
In his history-driven memoir, Deion reconstructs his decade-long cross-country quest and analyzes the evolution of his perspective on the commanders-in-chief and what it means to visit a cemetery.
If you're going to the gravesite of President Martin Van Buren in Kinderhook, New York, you could probably dig up his grave and nobody would find out a few days. So you never truly know exactly what you're going to find at a place or who.
All right, well, that is my book trailer. And I would like to, again, thank everybody for coming to this presentation, which I'm calling A Grave Legislative Agenda, Conversation with Author, Presidential Grave Hunter. Again, this is here in the historic 1903 chapel at Historic Congressional Cemetery, which is the venue, and we're hosted by the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. Is anybody here? I can't ask everybody online right now. Is everybody here familiar with the findagrave.com? Okay. So Find a Grave has a way where you can look up famous grave sites as well, and not just the genealogical stuff that a lot of people do. And I have been to 2,467 graves of folks that are designated as famous on Find a Grave. I have a little bit of statistic slide to show you. So the graves by the numbers, there are 39 deceased US vice presidents. I've been to the graves of all 39 of them. On my original run, it was 38. Subsequently, George H.W. Bush passed away, and I went and visited his grave. There are 43 deceased vice presidents. I have been to the graves of 42 of them. 3 years ago, Jimmy Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, passed away. It was announced a year later that his ashes were still being retained by the family, and they intended at some point in the future to inter them at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. As of now, in October 2024, that still has not happened. So if anybody has the Mondale's phone number and can get me an invite over their house to take a look at their mantle, I would appreciate it. But meanwhile, I'm stuck at 42 out of 43. There are 49 deceased speakers of the House of Representatives. I've been to the graves of 22 of them. We actually have one here, Philip Pendleton Barber, and potentially at some point the ashes of Speaker Tom Foley will also be interred at his memorial here, but his ashes, like Vice President Mondale's, are still retained by his family as we speak. And my current #1 mission is trying to get all of the Supreme Court justice graves. There are 104 deceased justices. Some were cremated, so I can't get all of them, but I've been to 70. Just some quick other stats. President pro tempore of the Senate. So who is in charge of the presiding over the Senate when the vice president is not present? President pro tem. And there are 89 deceased, and I've been to 37 of those. Declaration of Independence signers, 56, and I've been to the graves of 41. You can't get all of them. One died when his boat, or ship rather, sank in the Atlantic Ocean. Baseball Hall of Famers, there are currently 271 deceased, and I've been to the graves of 112. And maybe my most insane project is of the approximately 481 deceased U.S. cabinet members, I have been to 213. It just started with the presidents and snowballed. And I say that's the most wacky, but somehow I've also been to the graves of 6 of the 3 Stooges. So I don't know how that works. Again, a history major, not a math major. My book, Presidential Grave Hunter, One Kid's Quest to Visit the Tombs of Every President and Vice President, that we saw the book trailer for before, was released last year, May of 2023. From cover to cover, it's 252 pages. There's a lot of writing in there, but also a lot of images, over 50, I believe. It's 15 chapters, and I'm glad that it's gotten such great reviews. It currently has an average rating of 4.57 stars out of 5 on Goodreads and 4.7 out of 5 on Amazon. So I highly recommend that you pick up my book and help me pay my rent. Now, a lot of people, they think that the presidents, well, aren't they all buried in Arlington National Cemetery? No, only William Howard Taft and John F. Kennedy are interred at Arlington National Cemetery. The presidents are actually buried across 18 states and Washington, D.C. If you throw in the vice presidents, as I eventually did, you add 5 more states, so it's 23 states and Washington, D.C. currently. The map that I'm showing on the screen, the ones that are highlighted in red are where the presidents and vice presidents are buried. This took me over a decade to visit all of them. Now, who did I start off with? Well, I'm a native Rhode Islander, so the closest when I was growing up were actually the Adams presidents, John and John Quincy Adams, and their first ladies, Abigail Adams, Louisa Catherine Adams, who actually the John Quincy and Louisa Catherine have ties here to Congressional Cemetery. They were temporarily in, one of them was in our public vault and the other one was in a private family vault here. So I realize I might be the only person who has worked at all 3 places that JQA and Louisa Adams have been interred. I interned at the Church of the Presidents up in Quincy, Mass. I work here now, and in between they were at Hancock Cemetery in Quincy, where I also worked for a few months. Now, what really struck me about the Adams is, as I was learning about them in books and everything, then going to their homes and being where they actually live. This is where John Adams was when he was 8 years old. Now I'm here at 8 years old. Then I go to their gravesite and I see this is in the physical sense where his story concluded, or Abigail, where her story concluded. And I couldn't meet them. I couldn't go over their house and have dinner with them or talk politics or literature with them, but I was able to go over their home in a way and then see them in a way. So I remember being 8 years old and just running my fingers across the chiseled Quincy granite sarcophagi that had their names chiseled into it, and just really falling in love with going to historical places in this hands-on history adventure. Now, we didn't have a camera on our first visit there with my Uncle Craig and his girlfriend and my sister in 2003. So these are actually from the subsequent year on the return. Now, sarcophagi, coffin containers, basically. A little more ornate ones are with George Washington and Martha Washington at Mount Vernon, not too far from here in DC. They are in Mount Vernon near Alexandria, Virginia. Now, George and Martha are interred in this tomb with about 25 other members of the extended Washington family in a back room that you don't see. And that includes who I didn't know at the time was my first Supreme Court Justice gravesite, which is Bushrod Washington. He was a favorite nephew of the president in general. Now, you can see on the photo, this was my fourth presidential gravesite. It was the first one that I had my photo taken at. I was 8 years old, and it was very hot and humid on that. It was either last few days of July or first day or so of August in 2003. And it was so hot. So normally I wasn't wearing sleeveless shirts to presidential grave sites, but it was, and you can't tell by the expression on my face, but I was actually happy to be there. But it was oppressively hot and humid. I really like the Washington Tomb. If you haven't been, those who are local here can rather easily go. It has so many different aspects and interesting parts of its history that I can't get into it all today, but a friend of mine, I would like to recommend his book, Dr. Matthew R. Costello of the White House Historical Association. He has a book called The Property of the Nation, and I recommend learning more about the book about the tomb by reading Dr. Costello's book. Now, what is my favorite of all these presidential grave sites? And my favorite is actually my favorite grave of all time, and I'm glad that I recently got to revisit the site with my father. That is James A. Garfield's tomb out at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, of course, a lot of presidents were also members of Congress prior, and a couple afterward. So I just wanted to point out that President Garfield was a longtime member of Congress. He was a member of the House of Representatives from 1863 to 1880. So being that this is the U.S. Capitol Historical Society hosting it. Want to point that out. And then he was ever so briefly the 20th president of the United States, assassinated by Charles Guiteau. And he is in this 180-foot tall monument. And that doesn't even include the crypt level below ground where he and Mrs. Garfield, Lucretia, are interred. And I don't want to exactly say in tombs, you'll see why in a minute, but this is just a grand monument. It has this larger than life Italian marble statue, mosaics, gargoyles. Sure, it's just it recommend going enough because photos do it only so much justice. And here are some more photos. Another one of the statue. You can see some stained glass windows behind, some of the arched ceiling, and outside there's these life-size bas-reliefs, terracotta sculptures of different moments in President Garfield's life, when he was a teacher, when he was a Union general, when he was sworn in as president, and it's really, truly incredible. But he and Mrs. Garfield, they're not in sarcophagi, they're not in a wall or anything. Their caskets are just laid out on if you went into the or anything. So President Garfield is in a flag draped casket. Mrs. Garfield was next to him. their daughter Molly and her husband, their urns are at the casket side as well. Now, there were a number of presidents whose graves we couldn't get as much access as we wanted to easily. My father always hammered home to me the importance of documentation, and you want the photos to be as legible as possible, and we wanted to get as close to the person as possible. So Garfield, we actually had to cajole the caretaker with the keys to unlock it for us. It hadn't been opened in many years, and he'd even know what key ring it actually was. It was almost like you were in a Scooby-Doo cartoon or some haunted movie where somebody's got the big keychain with all the millions of keys, and that was accurate. And then that first key ring wasn't even correct, and he had to go get a second one after my father kept prodding him to please do so, and we greatly appreciated it. We also had to get unlocked the inner tomb of William Henry Harrison, another temporary resident here at Historic Congressional Cemetery. Actually, he spent more time in the Congressional Cemetery public vaults than he did in the White House. But now he and Mrs. Harrison, who never even made it to Washington, D.C., her husband's time was so short she hadn't joined him for the inauguration. So they are at the William Henry Harrison tomb in North Bend, Ohio, near Cincinnati. We had to get that inner tomb unlocked by Mrs. Beverly Myers. Also had to get the inner tomb of Warren and Florence Harding unlocked. You can see them through the bars, but still we always just like to get as close as possible. They're in Marion, Ohio. And in the bottom right here is a bleached out image. It was taken with flash in a very dark area. That was Grant's tomb in Manhattan. At the time of my visit in 2004, photography was prohibited inside the tomb at that point because they were concerned about terrorists who might want to damage the tomb or harm somebody with the images online. So even though there were images in books online, they just did not want people taking pictures inside the tomb at all. Again, specifically citing September 11th, 2001. And also you couldn't go down to that lower crypt level. You could view it only from above. As you can see, I got down to that level and did get a picture, the exact details of which you'll have to read in my book, but that was just a sampling of some of the grave-related we had. I was told Ron the and asked if I wanted to see President Reagan lie in state at the Capitol. And I said yes. And then the very next day, my father, Paul, was playing football and broke his arm. Somebody landed on it when he was trying to recover a fumble. There was a teammate of his that said, "Oh, it's not broken, Paul," and then grabbed his arm and did this, and then you could see the bone pressing up. He said, "Oh, never mind, it is broken." He said, "Oh, thank you for letting me know. I didn't already know." So how was he going to drive me the 400 miles from Rhode Island down to Washington, D.C. with the cast that went up past his elbow? Well, it really didn't look like it was going to happen for a while. And in the chapter, Rip the Gipper, R.I.P., you will see some of the details, including a plane that flew over the Capitol that resulted in evacuation. And it was very nerve-wracking for this 9-year-old that really wanted to see a president lie in state, you know, like most 9-year-olds want to. So there's only one picture of us together from the trip, and it's of us at the Washington National Cathedral the day after Reagan's funeral was there. And the cathedral is also the place where President Woodrow Wilson is interred, the only U.S. president to be laid to rest permanently in Washington, D.C. This was touched upon a little bit in the book trailer. There was a Vice President, Garrett Hobart. He was the first vice president under William McKinley. He died, and that enabled Theodore Roosevelt to become vice president after he was elected in the election of 1900, and then we know how that turned out. So, but it could have been Garrett Hobart that was president instead of Theodore Roosevelt had he not died in 1899. He's buried at Cedar Lawn Cemetery in Paterson, New Jersey. My father and I arrived to see the vice president's mausoleum, and the employee there was kicking out a family that had traveled from Colorado to see a family member's grave. And I was thinking, well, we're only about 200 miles away from our home in Rhode Island. We can come back some other time. And my father said, no, we're not going to do that. So he worked on convincing without talking to me about it first and conferring or anything. He convinced the cemetery employee to lock us in the cemetery for for however long it was going to take us to get out of there, whether it was going to be for the night or whatever. He said, don't worry about us. We'll find our way out. And this is a cemetery that, as the photo demonstrates, some wall with barbed wire on top of it. The 7-foot wall does not continue all the way around, but the barbed wire does. So he was just like, all right, we're gonna find the grave and we will get out somehow. Things are needless to say. I'm a more reserved personality, and as you heard multiple times, he's zany and boundary pushing is how he's described. Now, a grave that has set me apart from most, if not all, people with this quest is Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. He's buried at the private Rockefeller family cemetery in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Now, I have learned that there might be a couple people who did manage in the early days to get an appointment to see the grave, but overall, this has been the white whale for presidential and vice presidential gravesite visitors. So as you can see here, I'm almost like Dr. Livingston in the greenery there. It's currently the only publicly inaccessible vice presidential gravesite. Again, unless you have Walter Mondale's family's number to help me see their urn until it's finally laid to rest at Lakewood. When a vice presidential candidate, Paul Ryan, asked me how I managed to visit the gravesites, I said I had connections. What I didn't say was that it was because the tree connected with the fence. But so that was it was just amazing timing that this tree had fallen and allowed us access to the site. Now, what's also been touched upon a little bit is my interaction with James Lavelle. He was the homicide detective that was handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald when he was shot on live television, November 24th, 1963. He was also at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed, and I was going down to Texas. I was 17 years old, primed to get what at the time was my final presidential gravesite, Lyndon B. Johnson, and I discovered that Mr. Lavelle was 91 years old, still alive, and I asked if I could interview him for my website, kurtzhistoricscites.com, and I wrote him a snail mail letter, included already stamped and addressed envelope, so it wouldn't cost him anything. And 3 days later, 91-year-old Mr. Lavelle emailed me and said, that sounds like a great plan, Kurt. Hope your trip works out with everything, and here's my cell phone number. And I went down there with my father, and there's some hijinks that are involved because, of course, there has to be with my father. But it was a great time. We spent 3 hours with Mr. Lavelle at his assisted living home there. And he signed a poster for me of a cropped version of the Pulitzer Prize winning photograph by Robert Jackson that captured the Oswald shooting by Jack Ruby. I'm not going to get too much into this photograph, but this is the hijinks that I referenced my father. So I just wanted debates and about crazy laws, rules, and policies, and satirizing them in the most over-the-top, inane ways possible. And at that time, leading up to the 2012 Republican National Convention, super soakers were banned from the convention area, but at least to a certain point around the perimeter, actual guns were still allowed due to the open carry laws and the Second Amendment in Florida. So Mr. Lavelle was actually a very big gun proponent, and he said, well, that's ridiculous that you're banning super soakers and the guns are there. That's crazy. So he agreed for this reenactment with the super soaker as a promotional shot for our television show concept. So, but again, hijinks ensued with that, and again, you'll have to read more of them in the book. It's called Oswald the Unlucky Assassin, which nobody has really registered that that's a tribute to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit when they read it. But sometimes you have to do little things in your book just for you. Now, I have met two former presidents that were alive, not deceased. And my first one was Bill Clinton at the Brown bookstore, which is Brown University's bookstore in Providence, Rhode Island. I was 10 years old. This was another forbidden photograph because you have to remember that there was a time where we didn't all have cameras on our cell phones or that we had bringing around. So 2005, they were actually stopping people, no cameras. And how were we going to get a camera in there? Well, we managed to. Again, have to read the book. But my father, as I said in the book trailer, is really lucky that he didn't get tased or tackled or even worse by the Secret Service. But President Bill Clinton was very happy to get this photograph. He was just all smiles, even though the photographs, again, were prohibited. And in a full circle moment, because I really love those, in June of last year, so this was for a book signing. I don't know if I mentioned his book, My Life. So June of last year, my very first book talk and book signing was at the Brown bookstore, Brown University's bookstore. So where this happened, and I actually read aloud some of that chapter there. So a very, as they would say, meta moment and full circle. The second living president that I met is somebody who's been on our minds recently, former President Jimmy Carter. I met him in Roseland. It's not Roslyn, we learned, it's Roseland, down in Plains, Georgia, at the church which they are and were, in Mrs. Carter's case, members. So President Carter used to teach Sunday school there. My father and I went and listened to President Carter teach from the book of Nehemiah. And he was 88 years old at the time, and he just spoke, didn't even have a drink of water. He spoke for 40 minutes, was very, very sharp, and everything you would expect Jimmy Carter to be. But Jimmy Carter isn't the first person that you would hear because first you had to be prepped in basically drills or boot camp by a woman named Jan Williams, and she was the person that got you ready to interact with or not interact with President Carter. So she was, and she had us very intimidated, which I think was her job, and I think she enjoyed it a little bit. So it got to the point where people didn't even want to answer President Carter's questions. They were so nervous. So I actually have brought my second and final clip. It's a clip of President Carter from the actual service that my father and I attended in June 2013. And you can see how people are nervous. Just gotta lower the volume slightly, I believe. All right.
In college or high school or whatever. I don't know what age it is, maybe about and what is the purpose about studying the book? To learn what? Right? Do mathematics, right? At least adding and subtracting. So we study our book. And quite often, we attain that book. And so forth. And my key book along with me, I still have them on my shelf here in Plains. And when I got serving on a battleship, I laid on the submarine, quite often I would go back and get those textbooks to review what I had learned in college 5, 10, 15, 20 years before that. And they were very valuable to me. And I still have questions in my library. In fact, one of my big ones, I put this book on my shelf. This morning, we're going to be talking about a book.
Just trying to skip to the next slide. Yeah. So I recommend that you get Presidential Grave Hunter, and if you have to take a book off a shelf, like President Carter said, you have to do what you have to do. Now, I want to go into the more congressional-related part of the presentation now, again, tying into the host, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. And I had to start off with a photo that I don't know if they're going to be happy with me or not. But as I mentioned, I was the summer intern there in 2015, and I learned that the Warren Commission was in the suite that the Historical Society now occupies on the 4th floor of the VFW building. And I learned that through a C-SPAN clip that they still had Earl Warren's chair. And it was around my penultimate day or so there, and I asked the then chief historian of the society, so my boss's boss, if I could get my picture with the chair. And my boss's boss, the chief historian, said, well, it's like you can even sit in it. It's like it's okay, even though it has the tape on it. He said, knowing about our Scofflaws TV show concept, he said, oh, you'd probably love that even if it had the sign in it. So I did. So normally I would not be sitting in something that says don't sit in it, but here we are. And also I had to include Earl Warren's gravesite, which I visited a couple years later at Arlington National Cemetery. There's a number of Supreme Court justices buried there. He's a little bit set away from them, most of them, but he's next to Arthur Goldsberg. I want to throw in some other major historical figures, graves I've been to. So, member of both the House and Senate intermediate essentially has a towering tomb that has a statue of him up top, and he and his wife are entombed inside, and there's a photo on the right. He's got this very elaborate sarcophagus, all these details carved into the marble structure there. And he's at Lexington Cemetery in Lexington, Kentucky. And that is another cemetery that we got locked in, but that was accidental. And I have to go back there at some point to get Jim Varney, who was the voice of Slinky in Toy Story. So I regret that I did not know he was there at the time, because especially when we got locked in, that would have given me more time to go see him. But another of the Senate triumvirate, if you will, Daniel Webster is interred up in Marshfield, Massachusetts. Much plainer grave, you can see, as opposed to Henry Clay. Of course, also Secretary of State, had vied for president a number of times. And another one of the mid 18th century, 19th century, 1800s Senate grades. And another one, probably my favorite of these three for his policies, is the more strict abolitionist Thaddeus Stevens. I think we all remember also Tommy Lee Jones playing him so well in the Lincoln movie. He's buried at the Shriners Cemetery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he also has a cenotaph here, which those are for members of Congress who died in office. They got their cenotaphs here, designed by Benjamin Latrobe. Now, Thaddeus Stevens, he could have been in a little more prestigious cemetery in Lancaster. However, that cemetery at the time, as I understand it, was not integrated. So he ended up at the Shriners Cemetery. Here at Congressional, I mentioned presidents pro tem, and we actually have 4 that are buried here. So Uriah Tracy was the president pro tem in 100. Actually, Latrobe cenotaph, and again, that is a term that means empty tomb, except his is not empty. And there are also 3 others that have, or 2 others that have that same style grave, John Gaillard and Samuel Southard. So I just had their Tracy's photo rather. And then also we have Joseph Inslee Anderson. He has a more modern tombstone. And those are the 4 presidents pro tem that are interred here at Congressional. We also have a former member of House leadership is here. He was kicked out of office. He lost his reelection bid in that 1980 Reagan conservative wave. So you can see his near the chapel as well, his mausoleum. And I felt like I had to conclude with a good friend of the U.S. Capitol Historical Trustees for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society for a number of years. Her daughter, Rebecca, actually used to work here at the cemetery. We did not overlap, but I have met her when she has come back. And Cokie Roberts loved this cemetery. And I actually got to meet her when I was an intern with the U.S. Capitol Historical Society as well. So, and as somebody who myself is a future resident, I'm glad to be someday sharing this space with such a widely respected journalist and person as Cokie Roberts. And I would like to thank you all again for attending and or watching online. My website is presidentialgravehunter.com. Main website's kurtzhistoricsites.com. Presidentialgravehunter.com will get you there. On YouTube, I'm at Kurt Deion, and on Instagram, I'm at KD Gravehunter. And thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Yes, ma'am. Do you mean presidential or anybody? I would say that a lot of the Hollywood figures have just rather egalitarian graves, and they're really flat. I mean, you go and Walt Disney's in a little bit of a garden, but as far as the marker itself, it just says Walter Elias Disney. That's it. You know, Clark Gable. So a lot of the Hollywood figures, Humphrey Bogart, it's just there's nothing that sets a lot of them apart from anybody else that's buried there. Yes.
What was the most difficult presidential grave site access, not necessarily once you were there, but the cemetery or the area around it? What was most difficult?
Well, there were, I would say, a few of them are actually closed during colder weather. So the Adamses, which is actually the presidential gravesite I visited the most because I used to intern there. But they're closed to the public from November to April. And also the interior of James Garfield's is closed during cold weather too. So there was prior time I was in Cleveland and I would have liked to show my friend Kelvis the tomb, and we couldn't because it was January and they weren't going to be open for a bit. So some of them takes a little bit more planning than others. Yep. Yes. Within an hour of DC, it would just be Arlington, Mount Vernon, and Woodrow Wilson at the National Cathedral. If you go a little bit farther, you can get to Richmond, and down there is John Tyler and also James Monroe. And as a lot of people like to put an asterisk with, if you want to include Confederate President Jefferson Davis, he's also there at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Yes. Most of the modern presidents are at their presidential libraries. I believe the current total is 8. You do have some exceptions, JFK, obviously, at Arlington, and you also have Lyndon Johnson is buried at his ranch in Stonewall as opposed to his presidential library in Austin. Another exception when the time comes will be Jimmy Carter will not be at his library in Atlanta. He will be buried next to Mrs. Carter in their front lawn of their house in Plains, Georgia. So, but most of the modern presidents are at their presidential libraries, and I know that at least George W. and Laura Bush will also follow in that step, that pattern.
Got one from an online listener.
Yes.
Are there any vice presidents buried here at Congressional Cemetery?
Yes, so there is one. We used to have 2. So George Clinton, not P-Funk, was he was the first vice president under James Madison. He was also second vice president under Thomas Jefferson, so serving under 2 presidents. He was here from when he died in 1812 until he was exhumed in 1908. And he was sent up to his home state of New York. He's there in Kingston. Now, we still have his successor, Elbridge Gerry, the namesake of gerrymandering, a subject I'm sure that those interested in congressional history know all about, except maybe the fact that his name isn't Elbridge Gerry, it's Gary, and it should actually be gerrymandering. But there wasn't an audio clip circulating around the internet at the time of him saying, "Here's how my name is pronounced." So Vice President Gerry is here, and he has a grand monument that was made of marble, I believe it is from Massachusetts, his home state. And he's the only vice president buried in the entire district now. And he's also the only Declaration of Independence signer in the district. And he has a grave that I encourage those of you who are here to see before you go. And if you're watching online, come visit us sometime.
Double dip here, but another question. Having visited these presidential graves and seen the range of design they can use, what do you think we can understand about a president's or their family's thinking about their place in history, perhaps, or their philosophy of, leaving a monument from what you've seen?
Well, I think it's definitely a case-by-case basis, and there are various things. Like George Washington left specific instructions. So he wanted a new brick tomb to replace the dilapidated one that was previously at Mount Vernon, and so he didn't have input on all the little intricacies and specifics, but the general broad idea. And he was somebody who knew that his that his legacy would be analyzed. You have some that are more plain, like Martin Van Buren. It wouldn't really make sense for him to have something super elaborate in this little Dutch town or village in the Reformed Church cemetery or anything. James Garfield or Lincoln, yeah, they didn't have any input, but you can see that people really wanted to commemorate this fallen leader who they would have viewed as a martyr at the time. So Lincoln's is always interesting too, because they redid it in the 1920s and the interior is Art Deco, which Abraham Lincoln was not alive during the Art Deco architectural period. So I like it very much, and I'm a big fan of Art Deco. It's just anachronistic to Lincoln. So and definitely with the presidential libraries now, as we were just discussing, that's something where it really adds a punctuation mark on the interpretation and commemoration balance there. I know that I mentioned George W. and Laura Bush. They were originally not planning on being interred at their library, but then after Barbara and George Sr. died, they saw like how beautiful it was at their library and how it kind of really tied everything together. So I think that's a recent advent in understanding what modern presidents want and first ladies want. Oh, yes.
Several presidents, particularly, as long ago passed away, I think you mentioned some, were buried in temporary vaults while their larger graves were being constructed. How many of those were there, and are there any particular stories you have about some of the temporary vaults or holding cells or
Well, so here at Congressional Cemetery, I can say that we had three, William Henry Harrison, John Quincy Adams, and also Zachary Taylor were temporarily in our public vault. Some were meant to, in other places, they ended up being temporary, but weren't originally intended. So actually, Zachary Taylor was put in a tomb in Louisville, Kentucky, and then it was kind of run down, and eventually in the 1920s, they built a more recent one that he and Margaret Taylor, the First Lady, are now in, and the older one, which is in better condition than it was, it still stands just a few yards away, but that's what comes to mind. Lincoln at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, there are two temporary receiving vaults that held his remains until the main monument was completed. One of those two still stands today, and the other one has a marker because, of course, anything Lincoln related you want to commemorate. So it says here was the second temporary receiving vault that he was in from December 1865 to whatever year. So those are ones that come to mind.
Well, Kurt, I just want to say before I kick everything over, I just want to say thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I want to thank everyone who came out today to be with us in person, everyone who came out to join us online. We really appreciate it. We have recorded the webinar component of this, this presentation, which we will circulate by email. We'll send out the YouTube link to everyone, along with instructions on how you can find copies, if you're not here in person today, of the wonderful book, Presidential Grave Hunter. This is a brief moment, we always call it our NPR moment. The U.S. Capitol Historical Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on the support of our members. To have wonderful interns like Kurt and all the influencers who are here today to go about all of our public history work. And so we want to take that and thank everyone who supports the society and encourage you to keep up with our ongoing series of book talks and public history events. As we move into the fall and through our busy, chaotic election season, we hope you'll stay with us as we keep fostering and increasing informed patriotism. Thank you so much. Yeah.